he said. At this point, there's no choice but to kill them all. That time, Werkner asked Will if he knew which type of magic was most important in a dungeon. Was it offensive magic? Defensive magic? Neither. It was search magic, a common spell used to sense enemies and detect anomalies. It was an essential spell that every mage needed to enter a dungeon, fundamental and core to their abilities. At that moment, Will's team was surrounded. A spell shot past Will's shoulder, making him sit down. It turned out Theon had just defeated a monster in front of Will and grumbled, "You're in my way, you weakling." They were engaged in a chaotic battle with a large swarm of ants. Will felt a bit ashamed, thinking he couldn't even detect the enemies in time. No, it was that Julius's search range was broader than his own. By the time he was about to intercept, everyone had already cleared the area. Suddenly, an ant appeared behind Will, but it was almost immediately sliced in half. Ignore Zephyro's spell had saved him. He even used a gale to slaughter all the surrounding monsters. Will was amazed. One spell and he had wiped out everything. While Will instinctively dropped to the ground, Ignore turned to Liana and complained, "He's worse than I thought. Can't even serve as a shield. At this rate, I'm starting to doubt his usefulness, Liana." Liana, sweating, admitted that Will's performance was indeed disappointing. She said that if he encountered a strong enemy, he would surely prove useful, but for now, Ignore decided that Will would be the one to carry the group's supplies. How humiliating. Julius, while absorbing magical essence, added that he had warned them already that Will was just a hindrance. Absorbing magical essence into the staff would serve as proof of monster kills for the academy. The staff functioned as a storage device. Will, humiliated, could only stay silent. He really hadn't accomplished anything. The group moved on, and Colette shouted, reminding them to wait for Will, as he hadn't finished collecting the items yet. However, to the mages, these items seemed worthless. If Will didn't bring back a part, it would mean no credit points. In truth, he had managed to defeat one monster. The group was silent as Will hurried to collect the monster parts, his eyes filled with tears. Theon didn't miss the chance to taunt him, saying that even though he was on the team, he was still showing such weakness. How disappointing. Colette asked Will if he was okay. Will replied that he had known from the start things would turn out like this, but he had tried to help everyone in other ways. In the end, he had just been standing in the back, unable to do anything. Although he was aware that they were all exceptional individuals, the fate of someone carrying supplies was truly disheartening. The group continued deeper into the dungeon. Liana checked her watch and confirmed that they had been in here for a day already, so she wanted to take a rest. Julius felt uneasy, noting that the place wasn't very safe. Therefore, Ignore decided to set up a fire barrier. Under Ignore's magic, flames appeared and formed a circle, with swirling fire columns creating a spectacular scene. This was also a type of illusion. When Will touched the fire, he wasn't burned, but the monsters were terrified and dared not approach. Liana asked Will to quickly distribute the rations. He pulled out some dried food from his massive backpack and brought 3 pieces to Ignore. However, Ignore raised his hand to stop him, saying that Will shouldn't come any closer. He didn't want to have any contact with Will. Elves only interacted with those they acknowledged. Colette disagreed, arguing that they were teammates regardless. Ignore maintained a smiling demeanor, but remained firm in his decision, telling her to give up. In this group, only Liana was someone he acknowledged. Will told Colette to stop arguing. It was an elf custom, and he didn't want to debate it any further. Although Will wasn't happy about it, the elves were a race that had migrated from another world, similar to the dwarves, except they used magic and were respected. Their ethnic pride was sometimes irritating to others, but in return, their magical prowess often overshadowed that of humans. One of the Magia Windy currently in office was the queen of the elf race. The team lit a fire and cooked a pot of stew to have a light meal before sleeping. At this time, Liana shared her plan with the group. Their primary target was Nabarus, a 3-headed dog and the boss of the 10th floor. They would need to defeat it. Colette added that the monster was worth 110 credit points, the highest single point value they could earn throughout the entire practical combat course. Ignore also mentioned that every group fighting this boss had casualties, and it was a major boss for this entire practical combat session. Liana added, in other words, I formed this team to defeat Nabarus. I want to show the tower that I have the strength to beat a target worth 110 credit points. Liana did not want to abandon their goal midway. She said this to let everyone know they would take on the boss first. Ignore smiled and asked if Liana intended to skip other bosses on different floors. Liana decisively stated that she wanted to fight this boss with their full strength, and if no one had any objections, they would proceed to the 10th floor via the shortest route. Of course, no one objected. Will stayed silent. He had only earned 5 credit points that day, and things were looking bleak. Although he knew that defeating the boss would earn a substantial amount of credit points, he was still somewhat fearful. Will just reminded himself that he was heading toward Elfie's location to gain a bit more confidence. Meanwhile, the mysterious group continued their quiet hunt of students in the dungeon. The ground was littered with ant carcasses. The hooded man asked the flaming-headed one, "What are you doing?" The headless man could not answer but tossed up 2 student heads he had just obtained. The hooded man asked, "Have you killed all those above?" The Headless One used his dark magic to write a message in the air. So troublesome. I've already sent them all to hell. The hooded man read it and chuckled. Will's group had reached the 10th floor. The ground was littered with the remains of many magical beasts, their corpses scattered everywhere. Theon was puzzled about what had happened. They had encountered dead magical beasts all over the place. Julius speculated that other teams might be responsible, but Ignore dismissed this possibility. We took the shortest route without stopping at any base. It's impossible for anyone to have arrived before us. Meanwhile, Will was examining the traces on the magical beasts' bodies. These creatures had been killed by physical attacks with no signs of magic, and the wounds were inflicted by pure brute force. Liana moved forward and announced that this was the place where Nabarus would appear. However, Will did not hear any sounds. The silence was unusual. The team rushed forward and discovered that Nabarus had already been killed. It was impaled with several large rocks. Colette gasped and covered her mouth in fear, while Julius and Theon could hardly believe it. Who could have done this? Ignore noted that the magical energy had not fully dissipated, indicating that the boss had been killed recently. Liana quickly ordered to use search magic to scan the area. Will, on the other hand, closed his eyes and recalled Werkner's advice that search magic was powerful but not infallible. It couldn't detect intricate traps. If another mage targeted them, they might use concealed magic to hide traps, and even monsters might have individuals capable of evading search magic. At this moment, Will heard something, a sound with a very low frequency. He looked up in panic and saw a pair of cold, glowing eyes. A monstrous creature with a human body, a demonic face, and wings appeared. Will shouted, "Everyone, up above!" Immediately, the monster shot a blast, and Will used his anti-magic sword to block it. However, the force from the blast was still overwhelming, throwing the other members aside. Will gritted his teeth and decided to use his legs to leap to the side after the other members had moved out of the danger zone. Colette screamed Will's name, and the monster, moving as fast as lightning, shot towards Ignore. By the time Ignore noticed, he was already punched, with a broken arm and several cracked ribs, crashing into a rock wall. If he hadn't had defensive enhancement magic prepared, he would have been pulverized. Ignore's fate was uncertain, and Theon clicked his tongue in horror. The monster was not only huge, but also incredibly agile. It was attacking with punches. Although they managed to dodge the punch, the ground was torn up, collapsing the entire 10th floor. Will was falling downward, with other members clinging to the edge of the pit. Seeing Ignore also falling freely, Will didn't hesitate. He moved over the large rocks and approached, then lunged straight for Ignore, trying to grab him. Meanwhile, on the surface, there was a strong tremor. They thought it might be an earthquake. Rosti suddenly felt worried about Will, wondering if something had happened. As the dust settled, Will and his friends were still alive. Oh, they fell together? No, they fell in pairs but landed in different places, falling straight from the 10th floor. Had they perhaps exited the academy's boundary? Everyone was anxious, with Will still holding Ignore. Ignore was born into a prestigious elf family but had been ostracized since childhood for not being able to use illusion magic. The Queen of the Elves had bluntly declared that Ignore was a disgrace to the family and that they didn't need him. Even Ernul, his close friend, did not accept him. Ignore could only endure the fate of a powerless person, and that pain had been deeply etched into him up until today. Ignore woke up with his left hand throbbing painfully from the broken bones, and he saw a cat growling at him. Was this the pet of a powerless person? Meanwhile, Will was battling a gigantic serpent. Ignore was horrified to realize that they were no longer in the place they had been before. He effortlessly released a burst of magic to eliminate the serpent and turned to Theon and Julius, who were surrounded by monster bats. Both were shocked to discover that they were now on the 11th floor. The monster had smashed the ground of the 10th floor, causing them all to fall down here. Suddenly, a one-eyed monster bat appeared. Julius gritted his teeth, raised his wand, and felt that the situation was utterly dire. Although the 11th floor was still within Regarden Academy's territory, it was exceptionally dangerous, only accessible to high-level mages. Liana touched her head and coughed, realizing that this was the Nightmare Stomach, a vast area extending to the 15th floor. The maze-like structure and the strength of the monsters here were vastly different from the floors they had previously traversed. Colette and Liana had fallen together. Seeing Liana looking unwell, Colette asked her what happened. It turned out that Liana had hit her head on a rock during the fall, but fortunately, there were no serious injuries. The problem was that they were isolated on this 11th floor, which was fraught with danger. Liana took out her watch and said they needed to quickly regroup with the others to avoid being swallowed up by the dungeon itself. This was no exaggeration. Colette thought of Will and felt extremely worried. Meanwhile, Will had just killed another serpent. Ignore, in too much pain to move, had to sit still. Will apologized for not being able to provide first aid, but with so many monsters appearing, there was no time. Now that he had a moment, Will reached out, but Ignore slapped his hand away and shouted, "Don't touch me." Ignore still could not accept Will, believing that someone powerless like him should never touch a noble elf like himself. Will was speechless, his fists clenched, and he declared that, Even if Ignore harbored resentment against him for a lifetime, he would not leave Ignore behind here. He asked Ignore to let him provide first aid to his arm. Ignore gritted his teeth in anger, saying he could handle the first aid himself and demanded that Will hand over the supplies. Reluctantly, Will placed the first aid kit on the ground. True to his word, Ignore used his mouth and his uninjured arm to bandage his broken arm. Looking at the situation, Ignore was injured, and his gear was completely damaged. Fortunately, thanks to Rosty's weapons, Will still had 3 items left. His food and water supplies were enough for 2 days, and Colette's group likely had similar survival gear. However, in the extreme environment of the 11th floor, they might only be able to last 1 day. Will asked Ignore if they could navigate through the maze. Ignore thought waiting for rescue would be more appropriate in such a perilous maze. Will insisted that if they did not take action, they would die. This was how someone like Will would think. Additionally, if the monster was still on the 10th floor, any rescue efforts would be further delayed. Professor Werkner was connecting visuals to the 8th floor. The screen displayed an unbelievable scene. A large monster was chasing after students. Werkner shouted, asking what was happening, and Eliza, with dark circles under her eyes, informed him that there was a riot. The base on this floor had been completely overrun and annihilated by a horde of monsters. Werkner was horrified and asked about the other instructors. Eliza gritted her teeth, her face grim, and said, everyone has been killed. Many had their heads twisted. All their drones had been destroyed, and Eliza feared that the same fate had befallen the 9th floor as well. Werkner was appalled. This was not just a massive monster riot, but also a massacre of academy instructors. It wasn't a coincidence. Was it a conspiracy by someone? What was really happening? Professor Edward hurriedly appeared and said, the integrated practical training has been halted, Werkner. He then announced that due to the abnormal situation and the threat to the students' lives, they would both have to go down there. Rosti watched the 2 professors hurry away, and he said nothing, quietly returning to his tent. Kiki the cat was sniffing the air. The 2 had decided to navigate through the maze, but Ignore seemed uneasy and in considerable pain. He continuously used search magic for vigilance. Will suggested they limit the use of this spell, as overuse could deplete Ignore's strength. It was important to conserve their energy. Ignore refused to listen, yelling at Will to be quiet, arguing that without using search magic, they might be ambushed by monsters. This is the 11th floor, Ignore fumed, frustrated by Will's nonchalance. In response, Will calmly explained that the effective range of search was at least 140 meters, while his own combat senses could detect movements within 200 steps. If Will sensed anything, he would alert Ignore, who could then use search. This way, they could conserve their strength and achieve optimal results. Will also suggested that fighting the enemies should be left to him and Kiki, while Ignore's role should be to provide long-range detection. They would be in a tough spot if they encountered a horde of monsters. Will emphasized that they should not be afraid of being attacked, but should minimize the number of encounters as much as possible. Ignore lowered his wand and asked Will how he could remain so calm in this situation. Will, slightly surprised, then gave a wry smile and said, to climb the wizard's tower, I must fully commit to this practical combat. It turned out that Will had studied and experimented extensively with dungeons, even facing countless dangers, which made him somewhat more experienced than Ignore in this area. Ignore's face fell as he saw a horde of orcs appear before them. They had to take this path because the other routes were even more densely populated with monsters. Will charged forward, saying he would handle the enemies in front, while Ignore should deal with those behind. The 2 friends split their tasks. The orcs didn't stand idle, but charged wildly. Ignore cast a wind arrow spell, creating a powerful vortex that shot towards the enemy. However, with their thick hides and resilient fat, the orcs were only knocked down by Ignore's attack. Ignore was amazed to see Will effortlessly sever an orc's arm. He couldn't believe how Will fought as if there were no threat at all. Why? How could he continue to fight under these circumstances? To turn the unknown into the known, and the known into strength. At this moment, Ignore realized just how strong Will truly was. What about himself? Lost in thought, he failed to notice that the orc had gotten up. The sneaky orc had concealed its presence and moved quietly towards him. Ignore couldn't react in time. What could a mage do against a melee monster that was so close? Ignore cast Nardria, creating an illusory wall of fire around himself. Will, who was still fighting, observed his friend and saw the illusionary firewall go up. However, the monster showed no sign of stopping. Ignore was terrified as he stumbled back a few steps. Was this beast not affected by illusions? It had pierced through the wall of fire and was now opening its massive mouth, aiming to swallow Ignore whole. Ignore screamed in terror. While Will was engaged in combat, he quickly adjusted his grip, threw his sword with a powerful spin, and it flew straight into the orc's head opposite Ignore. Will didn't stop there. He swiftly moved in, slashing horizontally at the orc. The clean cut severed the beast in 2. So that's why he used the short sword as a throwing weapon? Ignore stared in wide-eyed amazement. Was this really Will? So powerful. Will asked if Ignore was okay and explained that the Jirjiza orc's sense of smell was incredibly sharp to compensate for its lack of sight, which was why Ignore's illusion had no effect. Ignore was silent for a moment before bursting into laughter, feeling utterly pathetic. Will sat down and reassured him, saying, "Not at all, you're an excellent elf." Ignore replied that he wasn't exceptional, but rather a failure. Will was astonished. A noble elf who usually scorned others was now calling himself a failure? Ignore told Will that he was the only elf who had remained at the academy until the 6th year. All the other elves had succeeded in climbing the tower. That was why he was always called names like the Inept One and the Shame of the Clan.